As you know, many of you who've been here, we've been doing a 7-week series on the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. We're in the 3rd week of that series now. And we've talked about the fact that these events took place over a 24-hour period of time. But for preaching and teaching's sake, we're spreading them out over a 7-week period. Important, though, to remember that the disciples have just gotten up from the Good Friday or from the Maundy Thursday supper table. They've just gotten up, started that meal probably about 7 o'clock in the evening. Jesus, we know, according to Luke, sent John and Peter to prepare that Passover meal. They've just gotten up from here. They've sung a hymn, probably from the Hallel, the Passover Seder, that Psalm 113 to 118, some of the verses within that would have been part of what they would have sung as they sung that hymn and they went out to the Mount of Olivet, down the valley into the garden grove, the Garden of Gethsemane. And we learned last week that Gethsemane means what? Olive press. Olive press. So they've been into the garden. Jesus went in to pray, took disciples with him. We know that they couldn't manage to stay awake. And when we understand that they've just gotten up from a big meal, maybe it makes a little bit more sense, as we said last week. Nevertheless, Jesus is in the garden when his betrayer and the chief priests and the elders and the scribes from the temple, his own people, not the Romans, but his own people, come in with clubs and swords, and with Judas' kiss still wet on his cheeks. He is arrested, his hands are bound, his feet are bound. Ironically, all the disciples have fled with the exception of one. Who was that? Judas, his betrayer, stands with him. It's now just a little after midnight when the curtain is drawn on today's story. I invite you to hear it. We'll be reading Mark 14, verses 53 through 65, the second part of the text you'll hear in the video. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself by the fire. Now, the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and none of their testimony agreed. Some stood up, gave the false testimony, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.'" But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But he was silent, and he didn't answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And all of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him and strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. Let's look at the video text. You saw the rooster and the rope when you came in and wondered. Now you understand that we've added this piece because of today's learning. I'd never thought about him being lowered into a pit. It brings a whole new meaning to the psalm, Psalm 88, as was mentioned in the video. Not a lot of time to process this, but a couple of things that I want us to think about, particularly today as we talk about Jesus being condemned by the righteous. And what exactly does that mean? We understand now that what Adam Hamilton described as a 20-minute walk back through the Garden of Gethsemane to the temple, to the high priest house, pronounce it different ways, Caiaphas, as he says, or Caiaphas, which is what my pronunciation guide suggests, that it was probably more than a 20-minute walk because this time his hands and his feet are bound. When he finds himself at the place of the high priest, he is there among the Sanhedrin who has gathered and assembled in the evening. There are 70 leaders. Those 70 leaders we think probably come from Numbers 11:6, where God commanded Moses to gather 70 leaders who could help him govern on his behalf. Actually, in Jesus' day, and according to Mark's gospel, there were 71 ruling elders, and they had gathered to help find out what Jesus' fate would be as a result of all the ruckus that he seemed to be stirring up. It's important, however, that we understand some things about the Sanhedrin. First of all, they never met during the night. They only met during the day. They always met in public, did their work in public and not in private, and they certainly never met during a religious festival such as the Passover. So immediately we smell a fish, and we see that this secret trial on a festival day at night instead of in public suggests that they're up to no good. If we doubt that these religious leaders had anything other than Jesus' condemnation in mind, all we have to do is look at what the other synoptic gospels say about that and Jesus' betrayal. You know, in those 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. And the chief priests and elders of the people gathered in the palace, which was called of Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. We see both Matthew and Mark agreeing on this. Interesting what Luke says. Now the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near, and the chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to put him to death, but they were afraid of the people. So we see from the very beginning, they already knew what they were planning to do, and so everything was done in secret to help support it. I want us to think, though, really, about what all of this means, that they did what they did as righteous men. And there were no women leaders in that day, the righteous 71. How in keeping was it with their system that they would bring one of their own Jewish brothers before them, and that they would find a way to publicly disgrace and humiliate and try him? We're told that many false testimonies were given against him that day. Matthew and Mark say that a lot of the testimonies didn't even agree with each other. And if you're in a room full of righteous and pious men who are legally savvy, they understand the Jewish law of that day, don't you think that not any one of them would have said, hey, testimony's not agreeing here. We don't have enough to try this case. Not so. You see, the decision was already made. As if that weren't conniving enough. I think it's important that we understand what many scholars have tended to think really happened, as it was the Jewish leaders conspired with the Roman officials of that day, particularly Pilate. In looking at our Jesus in the Gospel study 2 weeks ago, these words I think were very poignant and worth sharing with you. Jesus was not handed over to Pilate as a courtesy. He was handed over, according to John 18:31, because it was necessary. Because the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, was not permitted to put anyone to death. Now, the Sanhedrin had agreed that Jesus would be executed and that Pilate must carry out that verdict. And the rationale is clear. Historians debate, however, whether the statement in John 18:31 really is correct. They point out that by Jewish law, the Sanhedrin did have authority to at least stone to death anyone who was speaking out against their laws. Since the high priest declared it and the Sanhedrin agreed that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, the Jewish authorities would not have exceeded their authorities if they had stoned him.